Hey everybody, Smart Silver Stacker here. Today is Wednesday, March 30th, 2022, and right now we're taking a look at the 5-day chart for the price of gold. You can see that yesterday on Tuesday we had this big spike down in the price of gold, although it quickly recovered. And that spike down in gold was not limited to gold, it was commodities across the board. Silver was also down, I think, about 4% at the lows of the day. Oil dropped below $100. And equities, as commodities were dropping, equities were moving up in a big way, although essentially all of that has reversed at this point. We can go take a look at what's going on in the market right now, and we're about 10 minutes away from the market opening, and you can see that all of the major US stock indexes are in the red. Commodities pretty much across the board all in the green. We've got oil well over $100 again. Gold, it had dropped below 1900. Now it's at 1934, so pretty much recovering all of its losses. Silver also nicely in the green, back over 25 bucks. And that whole move that we saw yesterday where commodities were falling and investors' appetite for risk was back up was all on talks of a peace agreement between the Russians and the Ukrainians. However, that seemed to be short-lived. Now we're seeing President Zelensky stating Ukrainians are not naive and voicing doubt on Russian military withdrawals. And we're also seeing the US, they're stating that they believe Russia's pullback is repositioning, not withdrawal. So the Russians stated that they were going to be pulling some troops away from Kiev and that they would be focusing on the eastern region of Donbass. They came out on March 25th, actually, so last week, they came out and made a statement that they would be focusing on a more limited war to liberate Donbass. And Donbass is the eastern region of Ukraine where it's predominantly Russian speaking, saying that now they just want to basically liberate Luhansk and Donetsk. Those are the two regions that make up the Donbass. And, maybe that was the Russian objective all along. Maybe their objective has always been to simply get a pro-Russian independent government in the Donbass, and the invasion of the rest of Ukraine was simply a diversion, or maybe it was designed to help them meet some other kind of military objective. Maybe if they neutralize some Ukrainian military forces in central Ukraine before focusing on Donbass, maybe their hope was that the Ukrainians wouldn't be able to reinforce their own forces and their own supporters in the east. And if that was the case, it probably will prove effective. Here's this article from Monday from The Guardian where Zelensky said that he would be willing to discuss neutrality. And read a little bit from this article. Zelensky used a video interview with independent Russian media outlets to signal his willingness to discuss the idea of Ukraine adopting a neutral status and also making compromises about the status of the eastern Donbass region in order to secure a peace agreement with Russia. This is an interesting thing as well. If you think about all of the coverage of what a hard time Russia is having and how victorious the Ukrainian forces have been, and yet the Ukrainian president is willing to make concessions, even possibly ceding part of eastern Ukraine to Russia. So I do find that a little bit unusual. As far as Russia's grand strategy here, none of us really know, of course. They're being a lot quieter in terms of making statements to the media about what they're up to. And also, we're seeing a lot of footage and a lot of reporting from Ukraine, seeing footage from Ukrainian soldiers. Well, we're not getting any of that from the Russians, really. At least I haven't seen any. So, maybe this is all part of the Russians' grand strategy to begin with. Maybe their whole goal of this war was to absorb the eastern region of Ukraine. They do seem to be content to absorb and take over Ukraine one piece at a time. We saw them take over Crimea back in 2014, and now perhaps they're going to take over this eastern region too and kind of build in a buffer zone for themselves, if you will. The Russians like buffer zones. That's kind of what the whole Warsaw Pact was always about, was to provide a buffer zone between Russia and NATO. And so now we're seeing them do sort of what they've always done throughout history. Something else that we're seeing from Zelensky is he is still calling for tougher sanctions against Russia by the West. This is a story that came out yesterday from the Jerusalem Post, in which it details Zelensky's call for tougher sanctions, including an oil embargo. I think that's pretty important to note. I put out a video Monday night about the petro ruble and how Putin has been demanding payment for Russian oil and gas in rubles, and Western nations claiming that they want to pay in dollars and euros. We're going to have to see how that develops. If the West and Russia can't come to an agreement, it may turn into sort of a de facto embargo. Although I do expect that some compromise is going to be made there, because I think the Russians really do want the money from the Western nations for selling their gas, and also the West needs the oil. However, who knows what might happen? If we see something like a no-fly zone implemented, or if we see an escalation in this conflict, then certainly the Russians probably will be cutting off the taps of gas and oil to Western Europe. And if that happens, we're going to see much, much higher energy prices in the US, in North America, and in Europe. And also, if Zelensky is successful in calling from this embargo, we might see certain Western nations decide to turn off the taps to Russian gas and oil themselves. We saw the Lithuanian foreign minister calling for that in a tweet. I mentioned that in that video that I put out Monday night. And of course, Lithuania there is more vulnerable perhaps to Russian aggression than other members of NATO and other Western European nations, because it's right there in the east. So they may be calling for a tougher position against Russia because of that, because they fear invasion themselves. Where countries that are more comfortably to the west, they may think it's okay because they don't want to be paying higher prices for gas and oil. But the EU as a whole, they import roughly 25% of their total energy production from Russia. In some countries like Germany, it's even higher than that. This is no small thing. Calls for an oil embargo against Russia. If we do see that, that's going to have massive economic repercussions. And all of this peace talk, it does look like now at this point that this was all just kind of hot air, that this was just something in the news cycle, and that there's really not much to it. We're even seeing reporting now on Wednesday. This is a story that came out an hour ago on the BBC, how Russia is launching new attacks after peace promise. The governor of the Ukrainian Chernihiv region, which is near Kiev, just to the north of it. We can take a look at it on a map so you get an idea. This is Chernihiv right here. It's nowhere near the Donbass region in the east. It is right there near Kiev, just north of that. And the governor reporting that there are new Russian attacks, and that he does not believe Russia's promise to draw troops back. So, maybe the Russians are just buying time. It's just sort of an obfuscation as their troops rearm and prepare for a new offensive. I don't think there's any guarantees at this point. The risk of escalation remains high. We are now seeing the U.S. has put a carrier group in the Mediterranean within reach of Ukraine. So if we decide to implement a no-fly zone, that would be something we could do rather quickly with that Nimitz-class carrier group. And here's some further evidence, at least, circumstantial evidence, that the U.S. may become more embroiled in this conflict, and we may see an escalation where NATO does get involved. These are some remarks. This is from whitehouse.gov, so, straight from the source pretty much. Remarks by President Biden announcing the fiscal year 2023 budget. And I just want to read this question from the press. I'll read you this whole series here because it's rather interesting. Question, are you worried that other leaders in the world are going to start to doubt that America is back if some of these big things that you say on the world stage keep getting walked back? The president, what's getting walked back? Question, it made it sound like just in the last couple days, it sounded like you told U.S. troops they were going to Ukraine. It sounded like you said it was possible the U.S. would use a chemical weapon. And it sounded like you were calling for regime change in Russia. And we know. So then the president says none of the three occurred. Question, none of the three occurred? The president, none of the three. Question, Mr. President. The president says, you interpret the language that way. I was talking to the troops. We were talking about helping train the troops in that are the Ukrainian troops that are in Poland. That's what the context. I sat there with those guys for a couple hours. That's what we talked about. Okay, so I think that this is really quite amusing almost that the president, he's trying to do some damage control here, saying, I didn't tell troops they were going to go to Ukraine. I didn't say we were going to use a chemical weapon. In that process, he kind of lets slip another piece of information, makes another gaffe. He's talking about training Ukrainian troops that are in Poland. So he's revealing that the U.S. is possibly training Ukrainian troops. That is certainly a bit of an escalation, and there are now, I think, 90,000 new U.S. troops or NATO troops stationed in Eastern Europe. So this is a powder keg, everybody. One false move here and we could see a big escalation, and who knows what the ultimate plan is. And I don't really think you can take anything that any of these powers or any of these politicians from either side are saying at face value. Everything they're saying is designed merely to achieve some end, not to report on the actual situation. So I just would take any talks of peace or of a de-escalation with a grain of salt. We saw today as there's these new Russian attacks, commodities are moving back up. And that's kind of been a theme of this whole conflict. When things escalate, commodities move up. When things de-escalate or we hear news of peace, commodities are back down. Well, ultimately, I think either way, commodities are going to be moving much higher just because of the fiscal situation and the financial situation here in the U.S. With all the inflation and the fiat money creation we've been experiencing. I don't think the Fed is going to be able to get ahead of inflation. So I expect all of these commodities are going to be moving much higher in the near future. But if we do see an escalation in the conflict in Ukraine, if NATO or the U.S. or any other major powers get dragged into this, or, if we see something else on the world geopolitical stage, if we see China make a move against Taiwan, if we see some other hotspot break out, we got the Saudis fighting against rebels in Yemen. There's all sorts of stuff going on around the world at the moment. And if any of this stuff escalates, or if we get drawn into a bigger conflict, we are going to see commodities move up massively. If there's a no-fly zone and an oil embargo, or if Russia cuts off the gas, we are going to see crude oil and energy move up in a massive way. And that tends to bleed across into other areas of the economy when energy costs skyrocket. So, silver still $25. I do think silver is extremely cheap, and it has kind of underperformed other commodities up until this point, but I do think silver is going to have its day. I'm not really sure what accounts for its underperformance at this point. Maybe some manipulation, maybe paper markets. We saw with the nickel squeeze a couple weeks ago that paper markets certainly are unreliable, and that the people running them are doing so not to have fair price discovery, but to support the status quo and to support their cronies. So, maybe that has something to do with it. Maybe it's also just that silver is a commodity that hasn't been affected as much by this outbreak. Russia does export and mine some silver, but it's not like a huge percentage of world production. So hard to say what exactly is keeping silver so low. But for me, I'm viewing it as a buying opportunity. I'll be looking to acquire more physical metal at these prices. I'll also be taking a look at some of the miners. I think the gold and silver miners at today's prices are a huge value, probably one of the few undervalued sectors in the equities market at this point. But let me know what you guys think. Do you think that there's anything to these peace talks, or do you think that it's all just hot air and that this conflict is going to escalate moving forward? What do you think about commodities? What do you think about the price of silver? Let me know in the comments down below. Thank you all very much for watching. I do appreciate it. Appreciate every one of you who tunes into these videos. And if you like this video, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and I will catch you next time. Smart Silver Stacker, out.